This is David Gibson, and I'm here with Doug Bain. Say hello, Doug.
Hello, everyone.
All right, so we'll get right to it. I guess, Doug, what are we going to talk about today?
Right, so today we're going to talk about the problem of public folders and getting them migrated into something other than where they are, which is usually Exchange 2010 or Exchange 2007. And we're going to go through the process that we kind of use for our engagements and how Varonis helps us to accomplish those goals.
Gotcha. All right. So I guess some background first. Why do we need to move, and what are some of the things we should be thinking about?
Yeah. So for a long time, public folders were always one of these things that administrators have known is a problem. They know they'll get to it. They'll figure out at some point and address all the issues. But now with Exchange 2013, it's making that a reality, and now they really are being forced to deal with these issues, and they can no longer just kind of brush them under the rug and just throw more disk space at them. So, but one of the things that they have to be faced with is they have to look at their infrastructure and understand how are these new limitations in Exchange 2013 going to impact their planning and their migration. So it's making things a little bit tricky, especially for some of the more larger organizations, but even some of these can impact some of the smaller ones. So when you look at things like the total number of public folder mailboxes, how big they can be, how many messages, how many folders, organizations aren't just going to be able to just move things without even thinking. They have to just stop, do a really good assessment and think about what are they going to move, what they're not going to move.
So we've got some new limitations here. I mean, some of these look pretty big. Like, I guess, what's the limitation that people are most likely to hit first?
Yeah, so the thing I think most companies are going to hit, I mean, it used to be the total public folders in the hierarchy, but recently Microsoft made an improvement to that. But now I think it's going to be the public folder mailbox size. Even at 100 gig, which does seem like a lot, people have been putting lots of junk into these folders for a long time. And it's quite possible that would be their first thing that they have to worry about.
Gotcha. What's the biggest environment you've seen in terms of public folder mailboxes?
I mean, we've seen environments that have up to like a terabyte of a public folder store.
Wow.
And that's just a portion of their entire environment.
So, for those kinds of environments, this upgrade is kind of a
this is going to make them stop and really think about what are they using public folders for, and what do they need to be.
Gotcha. All right.
All right. So then the next thing is that these are problems that they're being faced with. These are new, but then there's the existing problems that have always been there with public folders. You've got unmanaged growth, where people have just been dumping mail and documents into public folders, and administrators and IT organizations have just been dealing with the growth of the public folders. And it's largely been ignored by management. They don't care about, well, let's deal with that public folder problem. They say, if we just keep throwing disk at it, the problem goes away. And then the other problem is around permissions management. There really hasn't been, what we've seen, good integration with the tools that organizations can use to properly administer the permissions on the folders. What happens a lot of times is that the permissions are given to the owner of the folder so that they can manage them themselves. So now you have end users going in and adding individuals with permissions to the folders and not groups, which is really not a good practice. And so now what happens over time is you have all these people have access to the folders. When they move out of the group, or let's say they're terminated or something, they're not being removed. There's no upkeep. So it really is this problem that's just been brewing for many, many years, and this is another thing that they're going to have to deal with. So even if some of these limitations don't impact them, they will definitely need to deal with this.
So a lot of growth, people putting all kinds of stuff in there, poor permissions management, kind of putting the unstructured and unstructured data. But just what's your sense of like some of the value of the data, though? I mean, this isn't just junk that's in there, right?
That's a good point. I mean, a lot of times you'll find account information, sensitive data, HR data, I mean, you name it. Anything that might make its way into a file system will be in here. In fact, some of these public folders are mail-enabled, so you have people emailing, whatever important documents into there, and they're just sitting there.
Gotcha. Wow.
All right.
So what do we do to get out of this situation?
Yeah, let's look at the overall process and how to tackle this. So, you know, we kind of look at this and we take three big steps to do a migration. The first one is you have to figure out what you have, and then you can clean it up. You do not want to migrate everything. You don't want to say, okay, here we go, we're going to do this migration, just move everything over. Because what you're doing is you're just moving the problem over. Here's an opportunity to look at what you have, find out what's the right place for it, who has access to it, how big is it, you know, find ownership, you know, update the permissions, and then do the actual migration.
And this is a process you've worked with some of these large companies in
yes.
doing, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is something that we found that works really, really well.
Gotcha. All right. So what's how do you start to figure out what you've got?
Right. So, you know, people can run PowerShell scripts and get, you know, information about public folders. But, you know, as a former Exchange administrator, I can tell you that having the Varonis tool is one of the neatest tools you can have, because you can get information, you know, that you can't get using PowerShell scripts. And in addition to that, it stores it in a tool that's very easy to use and very easy to get the information out of. With PowerShell, it's basically just got CSV files. But with Varonis, you've got these really great reports. You can find out the permissions, you can find out the folder sizes, and also, you know, the access, which we'll get into. And, you know, it really shows you, you know, where have folders been used and where they're not being used. So you can find out what's active, what's stale. And this is really going to help you, you know, understand what you need to do with the data. You know, if you just look at the modified date, that's just not enough, you know, because modified date only tells you if something's changing. So there's a lot of information that Varonis gives us that you just can't get from PowerShell scripts.
Well, so public folders are, you know, emails, right? Mm-hmm. And there's obviously on each email there's a timestamp, right? Mm-hmm. So I guess you could, at the very least, see the last time the public folder was written to, correct?
Right.
Okay. So I guess in your experience, though, are there a lot of folders that are not being written to but are still being used, like as resources?
Yeah, absolutely, all the time. I mean, you know, sometimes people use these folders for workflow where, you know, they're putting information in there and then there'll be like an investigation or be an inquiry and they'll have to go back and they'll have to look at it. Or it's just part of their process, you know, there might be some documentation there that they're always reading. So that happens a lot. I mean, a lot of times you'll see that the only activity we see on a folder is reads. And there are no writes, but it's active.
Wow, and public folders have no journaling or diagnostics capability at this point, right?
At this point, no.
Okay, so if you really want to see who's reading the public folders, you're going to have to use some other technology.
Exactly. I mean, you cannot, there's no other way that you can get this kind of information and present it in a way that is presented. It's fantastic.
Great. Cool, so then what's next?
All right, so then the next thing we do is, you know, we clean it up. So the first step in cleaning up is you got to categorize into different buckets. And then we look at the activity, okay, and who's been doing what, and we try to assign permanent owners. And then we'll reach out to those owners and get some response back from them. What is this used for? Are you the owner? Do you need this data? And then we look at how can we start culling down this data. Let's delete some of it. Migrate things to other repositories that are more appropriate, restrict access, and then make sure that there's an entitlement review process before moving forward, because this is just probably just going to go back to where it was. So let's look at the first part, which is categorization. So the first thing you want to do is you want to start categorizing this stuff into different buckets. So you've got stuff that's active, and you got stuff that's stale. So it's either being, you know, it's being accessed or not. And then we look at we create collections, and collections are basically logical groupings of folders based on security boundaries. So so you analyze the permissions. Okay, so these people have access to these folders and the subfolders. Okay, so we look at that as a collection. Now you have you've grouped all your data together in a way that you can now attack it by looking at access.
Gotcha. So on file shares, we do something sort of similar. We kind of have try to define a demarcation point. That's like a folder, and that's typically owned by somebody, and the permissions in general are pretty much inherited like down from there. Yeah. Right. With trying to keep the exceptions kind of few. So it's sort of a similar approach to all the public folders. Exactly. Gotcha. All right, that makes sense. What's next?
Next is the fun part. So. This is the part that, when you start digging into it, you always find people very interested in this information. So in order to find ownership and analyze activity for ownership, you have to look at who's been accessing, what they've been doing, and pull those reports. And then we take those reports and show them to the user. And this is the part that is so awesome. No one else could do anything like this. This is something that, I've always wished Microsoft would bake into their products, but they just never did, is that you can find out who's been doing what, to what files, how often, and use that information for multiple reasons. You can find out, who the owner should be. You can find out who's been accessing it and shouldn't have been accessing it. And it's a funny thing, a lot of times we run into situations where we show these reports, and the client's always like, wait a minute, why is that person accessing this? They left the group, like 2 months ago. And you see all these kind of inappropriate activity. It's just kind of like a side effect of this of what we're doing. But it really is an eye-opening experience for the client because they had no idea that this was going on, and they had no idea how often their data is being used.
Gotcha. One of the things that we found when we're doing the same process for like file shares, for example, is that having an audit trail to kind of say, look, these are the people that are accessing this data. They all work for you, right? Are you sure you're not responsible for this folder? Right. I don't know. Is anything similar like that for public folders? Or?
Absolutely. The exact same thing happens. I mean, you look at we'll look at the people's manager, and we'll find that there's usually like one manager that sticks out the most, but then there's another one. It's like, wait a minute, this person doesn't even report into this department. And we'll also look at what department they're in, and as well, and that also raises some red flags. So during this process, you always run into those situations where people are like, oh, we got to clean this up, and they're on board, which is great because now you've grabbed their interest. It's not just, oh, what do I need to do? Now it's like, well, we'll look at the information that we have here for you. You want to clean this up.
Gotcha. Wow, that's really interesting. So what's the next step here?
So during this process, we're gathering ownership and what we think is ownership. Now we have to reach out to the users and show them the data and have them tell us, okay, oh yeah, that stuff, we don't need it anymore. Or they say, oh, do you want to migrate this to the next version of Exchange? Is there a better place for it? So this is when you start, working with the owners and finding out what is the best place for this data. And then also introduce to them the concept of doing the entitlement reviews and what that process is going to look like, how often it's going to be, and what their role is going to be, in that action. So, it's a really important step because you have to include the data owners.
And in this way, you get some kind of record of that activity as well.
Exactly.
I gotcha.
Yeah, almost like a sign-off.
So then we start getting into the culling stage.
Right. So once you've categorized the data, you've found the owners, you've verified with them the data, and now you can start doing something with this information. So the first and most obvious place to tackle is the stale data. And you find that, it's amazing how much stale data is out there. And what we find that works really, really well is a staged deletion process where we don't just, go in and start deleting stuff, but basically move in minor stages. The first one is rename it to warn people that this is going to be deleted. And then you actually send out some emails and telling them what's going to be happening to this folder as a second step. And then we remove the permissions so that, if someone didn't get those two messages, now they've got the message that, well, they can't access it anymore. And then we'll move it to a different place so that, okay, it's gone, and then if no one's complained at that point, we'll just delete it. But, it varies on the organization. Some organizations, the number of stages, sometimes they want to do it a little bit quicker. or sometimes we want to put more time between each phase. So it varies.
Gotcha. At what stage do you find you get the most phone calls saying, hey, what are you doing? I need that.
Yeah, it's funny. The most frequent time people complain is when we rename it. Because that's where they think, because you put, two in big bold letters or big, all caps to be deleted, and that gets people's attention right away.
Yeah, it gives them kind of a sense of urgency.
Yeah, exactly.
That's interesting. Oh, neat. All right. So now
that you've done that, now you can take a look at where should this data, where should the data go? So you don't want to just move everything into public folders. Again, there's been a lot of technology developments, since public folders were introduced and people started using them. SharePoint is now a great tool. You always have your good old file system. And in some cases, a mailbox is the appropriate place. So take, for instance, the example of where you might have a team calendar. A team calendar, can be replicated using SharePoint. It's very simple. People's on vacation, or maybe we have like this event coming up. That's a really easy thing you can do with SharePoint. But if you're going to use something for like, scheduling, let's say a conference room scheduler, or schedule like a team schedule where people can invite a resource, that's something you want to move to a mailbox. So we've seen, use cases in public folders where you have, both of those. That's where you have to make those decisions. Where do we want to move this stuff to? And it all depends on the use case.
And I guess the use cases are also probably uncovered a bit with the owners when you're doing the surveys, too.
Exactly.
What are we doing that for? So that's why that stuff is so critical.
Right.
You'll never be able to figure out where it should be moved.
Right. In some cases, there's like applications that are using public folders, and those are really tough because you're not just going to rip that out. You usually just migrate those over because, that's a good way. But when they go to Exchange 2013, they'll definitely need to update their application.
All right. I guess just from your, are people surprised at how many different use cases they have for public folders?
Yeah, I think that because there's a history with public folders, and it was like, just an easy dumping ground, it's an easy place to put stuff. But as we see more technologies and different things you can do with that functionality, there's a lot more options than there used to be.
Yeah.
Also, I think that people realize that public folders aren't what Microsoft once wanted them to be, and they really need to make some decisions about, what is the future of this particular use case. And that's why this is a really great time to stop and think about it. It's like, public folders, do have some limitations, and public folders, are going to be supported, ongoing. But, still, you have to ask yourself, is this the right technology for me?
Yeah, and it sounds like in some cases, though, it really is it's still the place where you want stuff.
Right.
Yeah. Interesting. Huh.
Okay.
All right, so how do we clean them up?
Yeah, so hopefully, with those two steps, you reduce the amount of data that you have to move, maybe in half, maybe more than that, maybe a little less than that. But definitely, you've reduced what you need to move. And that's really, really key. So now what you want to do is you want to start cleaning up the permissions. Again, if you have less to look at, the cleanup is runs a little bit better. So, so before you move these public folders over, you have to look at the permissions that are there, clean up any open access, which is where everyone has access to the data, and that you'll see that when you run your access reports. And also in the permissions reports, you'll see that, there's one little funny thing that happened with public folder permissions is that when you add a user in the interface, it'll always select the default user when you're done adding them, and then people don't see that, and they'll go and they'll change the permissions to, let's say, author or editor or owner, and they didn't realize they just did that for default. And they say, oh, the permissions didn't change, let me go back and put it on the user, and now you've just opened up your folders to everybody. And we've seen this where, 30% of the environment can be accessed by the entire company.
Wow.
And they didn't even know it.
So the default user is kind of the equivalent to the everyone group
exactly.
in file systems.
Yep.
All right, wow.
It's very easy to kind of mess up those permissions.
Gotcha.
So this is really important. So what we do is we take the information that we get from the permissions that are there, the actual access data, so who's been accessing it, and we help the client create groups that those people will go in, have the owner review those groups, and then add those groups to the folders and remove all the individual permissions that are there. And that's a process of just cleaning up permissions and making sure that when you go over to the new system, everything's super clean. And then on top of that, make sure that there's an entitlement review process so that the problem doesn't get any worse.
Gotcha, so you can keep it clean.
Yeah.
So one of the things, this is a screenshot of Varonis, you know, speaking of the Everyone group, we've been helping people stimulate changes. So you can add groups, remove groups, change permissions in the interface in just a sandbox, and then see, hey, if we had made this change in the past, who are all the people that would have, you know, called the help desk screaming? The same functionality is, you know, available for Exchange here as well.
Right.
And you can also commit the changes right from here. So that process you were talking about, right, I guess the removing the individual users, making sure the default user only has, you know, or doesn't have access, for example. You can simulate those changes first and then commit them through Varonis.
Yeah, and this is a really powerful visual that you can provide to the user, you know, to the owner, when they see what's going to happen, and they really understand the urgency of getting this stuff cleaned up. Especially today, you know, with you know, access and security is sort of like in the forefront of everyone's mind. A tool like this is just, you know, so invaluable to our process.
Great. So then I guess it's time to get moving, huh?
Yeah. So you know, before you start moving things over, you have to map things out. Like we showed you the slide in the beginning when it comes to the different limitations. You have to make sure that you group your collections so that you don't exceed any of those limitations. And because you have your access data, you can also determine, okay, how many people will be accessing this data, because that's another limitation, the 2,000 concurrent users. So then you have to make sure that, okay, if you look at this particular grouping of folders, there are going to be more than 2,000 people that are going to be accessing them at one time. So that's something that Varonis helps with as well. So then we work with, we map all this data out. We work with the data owners to verify everything's going to be okay. You know, when things are going to start happening, what they need to do. You know, check out the permissions, make sure everyone has access, and then you just migrate it over. The process of migrating over to Exchange, you know, that's going to be, you know, using the Exchange migration tools. Or there could be some third-party tools that people want to use.
Makes sense. So I guess got some parting thoughts, right?
Yeah.
And then we'll open up to questions after this.
Sure. So, you know, metadata does make the difference. I mean, I can't tell you, I can't stress enough how you really can't do this project on a large scale, without the information that Varonis gives you. If you do, you're just guessing and you're just making a lot of work for yourself. You're going to be moving data that you don't really need to move over. You're going to be, you know, making a problem where it is now and just moving it over to Exchange 2013. You're really not solving anything. You know, now is the time to do it, and having this information is really helpful.
So how long, you know, in a typical company, do you think you should anticipate an end-to-end migration would take?
Yeah, I think like kind of like a mid-sized company, you know, you should be looking at 6 to 9 months. You know, as long as their information stores aren't too big, to do a project like this. It could be longer if they have a lot of data, because the actual migration of the data could take some time, depends on their Exchange environment. You know, and in some of the large organizations could, you know, take easy a year or more because of the amount of information that you have to review with the end users, the amount of data that you have. You know, it will take some time.
How much of that time should you spend planning?
You know, planning is really the key. You know, I would say on, let's say, a 9-month engagement, you might spend up to maybe, you know, 5-6 months of planning. You know, it's really, really important. You know, and during that time, you're going to find, you know, the things that, you know, the data that you don't need to migrate. You know, the more time you spend asking about the information, you'll find that people are like, you know what, we really don't need that. That can be archived or just plain deleted.
So the more time you spend in that phase, the less that you actually have to move.
Yeah.
Gotcha. So Varonis does offer a free 30-day eval where you can install and get some of the metadata about your Exchange environment. What can somebody do with that 30-day eval if they're facing an Exchange migration?
Yeah, and I think that this is really a great offering from Varonis because allows you to not only find out what's in your environment, because a lot of times, it's like, yeah, you have your public folder, you can see how much disk space you have and everything, but really getting a really good inventory of the data itself and the permission structure and looking at the security issues, that's something that you can't do using PowerShell scripts very easily. And then, so you can find out basically the scope of your environment, and you can actually start seeing who's touching what. You can actually get some really good data in 30 days. I don't think it'd be good enough to plan for a time migration. It would be really good to understand how big of a problem you have and what's it going to take to get there.
Makes sense. So a couple things just about the evaluation. We install, typically we come in and install in about an hour or so, or in the morning, go to lunch and come back and look at some data, and you'll be able to see, for example, you can double click on any public folder or mailbox and see all the groups and all the constituent users that have access, as well as the level of access they have to that public folder. By the way, this works on Windows shares, Unix shares, NAS devices, SharePoint, and Active Directory as well. You can double click on any user. Here's that dreaded default user, right, or default user. Then you can see where the default account has access, or any user or group you can see. I guess just at the end of the WebEx here, we'll open this up to questions, but when you close your window, you'll get an opportunity to get a free consultation with Sphere and Verona, so you can do the evaluation install, start to talk about the scope of the project, make sense of it, and things like that. So with that, I guess we'll open it up to a couple of questions. We've got one here. My company has an internal audit about open access to sensitive emails and public folders. What would be the first thing that you do?
Yeah, so the first thing I do is I go to Verona, download the free trial, because one of the reports that Verona can provide is where does the Everyone group have access in the public folders. And, that's just a report that you can get, right out of the box. So you install it, probably depending on the size of the environment, a few days later, you can have that information. And it's really powerful and scary at the same time.
Gotcha. So let's see. We'll see if there are any other questions here. All right, one came in. So the first step was to categorize and clean it up. Can you say a little bit more about what that means? Not really clear on the collection thing.
Okay, so what we do is we have this concept where we look at permission and audit activity, and we look at, what departments are these people in, how are they grouped together. So if we see like the same people accessing some folders, that tells us, okay, well that folder and all the subfolders are what we call a collection. And that allows you, so these are all the people that are using this for a particular department. Then when you look at when you marry that with the folder structure, you begin to see, okay, how the company has laid them out. Sometimes what happens is they'll create, let's say, some folder, let's say you were showing before you had like HR, finance, and everything. You might think that those are the collection points, but if you go underneath there, sometimes the permissions have kind of forked and they change. And now you have to go down a level to get to where the top level folder is that people have started to put all the subfolders and all their information. So it's a pretty involved process, but it's pretty good.
Gotcha. Got another one here. Once you've identified the folders and or user rights that need correcting and you commit the changes, is there a way to have the results of the panel effects listed output to the future? And I think this is a question about the simulation in Verona. And basically, if you simulate changes, can you basically report on the effect of those changes over time? And the answer is yes, you can. So you can do a bunch of changes and then kind of let it sit that way in Sandbox for a while, and then get a report of all the kind of exceptions, right? If you had made this change, here are all the people that would have been affected. So let's see here. And by what and who will be affected, I should make that clear in the simulation. Those are users that have been accessing the public folder via the permissions that you're thinking about revoking and have no other way to get there, right? So it really is kind of doing a pretty sophisticated calculation there and saying, okay, these are all the users that would have been affected by the removal of this group. For any of those that have been actually using that folder, do they have any other way to access that folder? And if not, they show up as the list of what we call errors.
Okay.
All right, see if there's another one. Okay, how do you identify applications that are integrated into public folders?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of times, like I said earlier, applications are, do utilize public folders, but it's not always clear that it is an application. So one of the things that we do, and this is again using audit data, you can tell the difference between a service account and user account. There's a variety of ways that you can do that. But so you can look at just the account itself. Another thing that we also seen is that service accounts do a lot more work than people. So there's a lot more activity. So when you usually look at the highest level of activity, it's going to be that service account. And that indicates to us that this is an application. So you can run reports based on that, highest level of activity on a folder, and that'll point you to where the applications are.
Gosh, that makes sense. All right, I guess we'll keep it open for just a minute or two, and then we'll wrap up. So if you have any other questions, feel free to type them in. And if there are none others, then thank you so much.
Okay.
And yes, thanks, Doug, for presenting for us, and
thanks
thanks
very much.
Kim for hosting us.